When those who have crossed the ultimate line of human depravity, like cannibalism, are thrown into a prison full of hardened criminals, survival isn't just uncertain, it becomes a brutal test of who can withstand the darkest form of justice. Today we're talking about 4 dangerous cannibals who met a tragic fate in prison. Richard Chase. Richard Chase, also dubbed the Vampire of Sacramento, was driven by terrifying delusions that led him to commit unspeakable acts. But once locked away, the horrors he unleashed on others came full circle, leading to a tragic end. Chase's early life was marked by a disturbing blend of violence and mental illness. From a young age, he exhibited behaviors that set him apart, such as setting fires, cruelty to animals, and bedwetting. These early signs are often referred to as the McDonald triad, which is sometimes seen in individuals who later commit violent crimes. His parents' strict discipline and his own growing paranoia only fueled his erratic behavior. By the time he reached adulthood, Chase had developed a deep fascination with blood, leading him down a dark path. After attempting to inject himself with rabbit blood, Chase was institutionalized and diagnosed with severe schizophrenia. However, the mental health system failed to provide him with the help he needed. He was released from the hospital despite his bizarre behaviors, which included killing animals and drinking their blood. Once out, Chase's delusions intensified, and he began to believe that his blood was turning to powder, and that only by consuming others' blood could he stay alive. Chase's crime spree began in December 1977, when he shot and killed 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin in a random drive-by shooting. Over the next month, his murders escalated in both frequency and brutality. He targeted people whose doors were left unlocked, believing that an unlocked door was an invitation to enter. One of his most notorious crimes occurred on January 27, 1978, when he broke into the home of Evelyn Miroth. Inside, he killed 4 people, including a 22-month-old baby, whom he later cannibalized. The FBI was eventually called in to help capture Chase. They created a psychological profile that perfectly matched his behaviors and circumstances. It wasn't long before a tip from an old acquaintance led the police to his apartment. There, they discovered a horrifying scene: blood-stained walls, human brains in the refrigerator, and a blender caked with blood and rotting organs. Chase was arrested and put on trial for 6 counts of murder. In prison, Chase's fellow inmates, aware of his gruesome crimes, kept their distance, and his paranoia persisted. He continued to believe that Nazis were trying to kill him and that UFOs were controlling his actions. During interviews, he once handed over a stash of macaroni and cheese that he had been hoarding in his pockets, convinced that the prison officials were trying to poison him. Ultimately, on December 26, 1980, a guard found him dead in his cell. Chase had saved up his prescribed antidepressants and used them to commit suicide. Stephen Griffiths. Stephen Griffiths, known as the Crossbow Cannibal, is a name that still sends shivers down the spines of those familiar with his crimes. His story? Well, unlike the others on this list, it's not just about the horrific acts he committed, but also about the chilling transformation of an academic into one of England's most notorious killers. Nevertheless, in prison, did he find the justice he so cruelly denied his victims? Raised by his mother after his father left, Griffiths grew up in Wakefield and seemed to follow a somewhat ordinary path. However, beneath the surface, he harbored disturbing fantasies. At just 17, he was already predicting his future as a killer during a check-in with his probation officer. His early criminal behavior included violent assaults and threats, which landed him in psychiatric care, where he was diagnosed as a sadistic, schizoid psychopath. By the mid-2000s, Griffiths was studying for a PhD in criminology at Bradford University, focusing on homicide, a subject that seemed disturbingly close to his dark interests. He was fascinated by serial killers, particularly the Yorkshire Ripper, and aimed to emulate their crimes. So began his killing spree in 2009, targeting vulnerable women in Bradford's red light district. His first known victim, Susan Rushworth, disappeared without a trace. Almost a year later, he killed Shelley Armitage, whom he not only murdered, but also filmed during her dismemberment. His third victim, Suzanne Blamiers, tried to escape after being kidnapped, but Griffiths shot her with a crossbow in a brutal act that was captured on CCTV. This footage ultimately led to his arrest. In court, however, he chillingly referred to himself as the Crossbow Cannibal, claiming to have eaten parts of his victims. He pleaded guilty to the murders of Rushworth, Armitage, and Blamiers, and was sentenced to life imprisonment imprisonment with no possibility of parole. Griffiths was sent to HMP Long Lartin, where he remains to this day. Griffiths' life in prison has been anything but peaceful. He attempted suicide multiple times, including a 120-day hunger strike, and has been the target of violence from other inmates. In 2019, he was attacked with a sharpened piece of wood, sustaining serious injuries, though he survived the assault. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov, left a trail of terror across the Soviet Union with his gruesome killings. But when this monstrous figure finally faced justice, his courtroom antics shocked the world. This brought an end to one of history's most chilling murder sprees. Also known as the Butcher of Rostov, Chikatilo was born in Ukraine in 1936. During a time of famine and political turmoil, Chikatilo grew up in extreme poverty. His childhood was further darkened by tales his mother told him about an older brother who was allegedly kidnapped and eaten by starving neighbors. Despite his troubled background, Chikatilo initially led what appeared to be a normal life. He served in the Soviet army, married, and even became a teacher. However, beneath this facade, Chikatilo struggled with severe sexual dysfunction, leading to deep feelings of inadequacy and rage. His inability to perform sexually drove him to commit acts of sexual violence against his students, which eventually escalated into murder. Chikatilo's killing spree began in 1978, when he murdered 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova. Although another man was wrongfully convicted and executed for this crime, it marked the beginning of Chikatilo's reign of terror. Over the next 12 years, he would go on to murder at least 52 people, primarily women and children. His method was gruesome. He would lure his victims to secluded areas, often near bus or train stations, before stabbing them to death. Many of his victims were mutilated post-mortem, with some reports suggesting he engaged in cannibalism. The Soviet police, unaccustomed to dealing with serial killers, were initially slow to connect the murders. Even when Chikatilo was arrested in 1984, he was released due to a blood type mismatch in forensic evidence, a mistake that allowed him to continue killing. It wasn't until 1990, after the murder of Svetlana Korostik, that Chikatilo was finally caught. An undercover officer noticed his suspicious behavior at a train station and took him in for questioning. This time, the evidence was irrefutable. Chikatilo's trial in 1992 was as shocking as his crimes. He was kept in a metal cage during the proceedings to protect him from the families of his victims, who were understandably enraged. Throughout the trial, Chikatilo displayed bizarre behavior, at times bursting into song or making outlandish statements. He confessed to 56 murders, though he was convicted of 52 due to lack of evidence in some cases. The court sentenced him to death, and on February 14, 1994, Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer turned his apartment into a house of horrors, preying on young men with terrifying precision. But after his capture, the nightmare took a new form. What happens when one of America's most feared killers is at the mercy of fellow inmates? Dahmer's path to darkness began in 1978 when he started luring young men into a deadly trap under the guise of friendship or financial offers. But what he did next was the real stuff of nightmares. He drugged them, killed them, and then committed acts of necrophilia and cannibalism, often keeping parts of their bodies as grotesque souvenirs. 17 lives were already lost by the time the horror of Dahmer's crimes came to light. In 1991, one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape and lead police back to Dahmer's apartment. What they found there was beyond anything they could have imagined. Dismembered body parts, photographs of mutilated corpses, and a vat filled with acid used to dissolve human remains. After his arrest, Dahmer's confessions were as chilling as the evidence found in his home. He spoke candidly about his crimes, detailing how he boiled the skulls of his victims and even ate parts of their bodies. Sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in 1992, Dahmer was initially kept in isolation for his own protection, but isolation couldn't keep his dark impulses in check. After a year, Dahmer requested to be moved to a less restrictive unit, hoping for more interaction with other inmates. He even claimed to have found religion, being baptized in a prison whirlpool tub in 1994. Despite this professed change, Dahmer couldn't resist his macabre sense of humor. He continued to joke about cannibalism, molding his prison food into shapes that resembled body parts, and making other inmates deeply uncomfortable. His behavior made him a target, not just for their scorn, but for something far more dangerous. On November 28, 1994, while cleaning a restroom with two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver, Dahmer was beaten to death with a metal bar. Scarver later said that Dahmer's gruesome jokes and unsettling demeanor had pushed him over the edge. If you enjoyed this video, you should click on the ones displayed on your screen to enjoy more content. See you next time.